Well, tonight, it's been the first time we're together in a couple of weeks, just long weekend, and then VBS. At VBS, I'll tell you, I didn't teach on Revelation, I taught on Jonah, so it was a fun time last week as we dealt with that. So remember the last time we were together, we hit to the millennial reign of Christ. Yes. And the book of Revelation doesn't even really give us any information of what takes place during this time. Outside, it's Christ is reigning, and the saints reign with him, and then it jumps to the end. And this isn't unusual when it comes to a lot of the end time events that take place. When we studied the book of Daniel, we saw that happen quite a bit, where Daniel would start talking about something that's going to take place very quickly, and then all of a sudden jump right to the end, with leaving out details in the middle. So we kind of fill in details with the rest of Scripture. And that's one thing to note, that the Scriptures, they're an anthology of books, but it all has one subject. And that's one of the majesties of the book, is that it's not a book that is just written by, and I'll explain this in a second, it's not written by one author that's using his earlier works to adapt later stuff. In other words, when we see something that in the book of Revelation that we're like, oh, that was written about earlier, we're not saying John sat down and wrote earlier and then remembered to go back and let me fill in details here with congruity errors or things like that. So what I'm talking about is human authors here, where we have like 40 human authors, with what we also understand, and we know that there's one ultimate author who's the author of all history. But with that, what we see then is that God revealing his plan throughout the Scriptures and throughout history. And so last week we kind of filled in using Zechariah, using Ezekiel and Isaiah, kind of filling in the Millennial Kingdom as best we can, although there's a lot that we still don't know, and well, we won't know until it takes place. That's the beauty of it. I think that's part of the celebration of it. We get enough to whet our appetite, as it were. We got a mouche-bouche, if you want a restaurant term there. Just give you a bite, but enough to excite us. But now we're jumping in Revelation with it to the end. This is going to touch on a little bit that we touched on last time a couple of weeks ago. But we're going to the end, and now we're hitting that Satan is released, and we're going to talk about that, and then the final judgment. And then in the coming weeks, we're going to unpack the new creation. So let's pick up Revelation chapter 20. We'll start at verse 7. And for the moment, I'll just go to verse 10 before I continue on into the judgment. It says, "Now, when the 1,000 years have expired, Satan will be released from his prison, and will go out to deceive the nations, which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. They went up on the breadth of the earth, and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. And fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. The devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone. Let me read that again. The devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever." All right. Now, the reason I had to reread that is because when you pause in the wrong spot, it breaks up what is actually being said there. As we covered a little bit last week, we run into this kind of interesting question. What's the point of this? In other words, Jesus has come back. You already had the battle at Armageddon, the gathering of Armageddon, the armies. They marched against the city. Jesus returns and he wipes out the army. But instead of declaring final victory right then and there, he binds the dragon. The false prophet and the beast are thrown into the lake of fire. He binds the dragon for 1,000 years. And by all accounts, there's no reason to think that that's a figurative amount. You can try to do that, but it doesn't work, especially because it really limits it, say, when the 1,000 years are up. But then at the end of it, he lets them go just to almost repeat the process. And it seems kind of strange. But there is a really good logic for this. And I'm going to unpack that just a little bit. And it has to do with all of this together of how God often executes his judgments. And one of the things that we often will accuse people of when they pass judgment on something, we'll say, well, you don't know the whole story. It's kind of a thing. And even when you read things and you read reports and you hear things from people, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be a relationship that's broken up and you're friends with one of them. You're going to get their reports kind of thing. And you're like, oh, okay. So, and then whether we like it or not, we'll still pass some kind of judgment. Even though we're like, I really shouldn't, but we do. And I've learned over the years, because although my whole life hasn't been a pastor, for the most part, I've been in some kind of ministry role, and with the exception of very early on, I've almost always been in some kind of role that requires me to exercise discipline and judgment. And so even from early on, I learned the old adage that people say, well, there's the right side, there's the left side, and then somewhere in the middle, there's the truth. And I've learned to function in that, where I listen to one side and I listen to the other side, and then I try to figure out what commonalities are there, and then what is most likely to happen, understanding that most likely most people are going to paint themselves as the victim. Even when they're the aggressor, they're still going to paint themselves as the victim. So you try to figure it out. And so when people look at that, it's like when you have a judge who's going to come in, well, you want the judge to have the whole picture. And one of the things that people will tend to accuse God of is, well, God is out there and we're here. And a lot of times when you start to look at some of the judgments in their start part, it's the cry against such and such a place has reached me. In other words, it almost sounds like the children are coming and complaining to dad that so-and-so is mean, kind of thing. Yet what we'll actually see is that it's not the case, that God often steps into history to meet the criteria that humanity even has. Not that he needs it, but he does it to take out any sort of objection. For example, take a look at the events of Sodom and Gomorrah. God comes and we have a Christophany, and he meets with Abraham, and he sits and talks, and then after the meal, and they're about to go on their way, he says, should I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? In other words, he already knows what he's going to do. And then so he tells Abraham, I've come down, the cry against Sodom has reached me, and I've come down to see if it's really as bad as they say. Now, is that God going, you know what, I'm not entirely sure about this? Or is it more likely that what would the people of Sodom actually accuse? Well, God, you don't actually know what's going on. You don't meet our criteria. It's like, no, I'm actually going to come check it out, so I'm going to take away your ability to appeal, kind of thing. And this isn't the only time. When you look at how God dealt with Adam and Eve, he walks into the garden, and what's he do? Where are you? And Adam's like, well, I heard you walking in the garden. I was naked, so I hid. Instead of God going, yeah, I already know, he goes, wait, who told you that you're naked? Did you eat of the tree I said not to? He's giving him a chance. A little bit later, what do we get? We get Cain and Abel. Cain's out, and God goes, hey, Cain, where's your brother? And Cain goes, what? Am I my brother's keeper? Was God going, I have no idea. I can't find Abel. Where is it? No, he's not. Because as soon as Cain says that, what does God say? He's like, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. In other words, God already knows it. What was he doing? He was saying, I already know this, but let's give you a chance to confess it. I'm going to check it out. In other words, anytime people come with accusations against God, it's like, well, you don't really know. It's like, well, sure I do. I already know it, and I'm going to wipe out most of your objections for your defense so that you can't play a plausible deniability. If you remember this morning when I talked about Bill C-4, and I said that in the preamble, and I didn't just say this, I showed you in the preamble, that the law actually states that they don't want to perpetuate the myth that heterosexuality is the correct way, the proper way. And proper gender expression, male and female. And I said, like it or not, it's calling the Bible a myth, but at the same time, they're trying to play plausible deniability, saying, well, where did we say Bible? We didn't really say that. It's like, you're reading that in. It's like, no, that's exactly what you're actually saying without saying it. And people try to use this kind of scapegoat. It's kind of like, I didn't really say who did this, but the person was wearing a green hat, red shirt, jeans, and sneakers. But nobody knows who I'm talking about. So I got plausible deniability. And one of the things that people often say against God is like, well, it's not my fault. The devil made me do it. It was Satan who deceived me. It's not my fault. You brought it about. But what do we have here? We got a situation where Satan is locked up. He can't deceive. And at the end of this time, what do we have? It seems, again, we've got the vast majority rebelling against Christ. And think about, what is the one biggest objections that atheists often like to use, like Christopher Hitchens and them? It's like, what would it take for you to believe that God exists? Well, I would have to see him. Well, what's going on in the millennium? Jesus is reigning from Jerusalem. That excuse is gone. So you can't say it's because I didn't see him. It can't be because I didn't know. It can't be because I was deceived by the enemy or by Satan. No, it shows that the real condition is humanity. Yeah. We're in willful rebellion against God because of sin. And so when Satan is released, and so he's going out to deceive the nations, well, what's he deceiving them about? Well, you got to think, throughout this time, even during the millennial, it seems hard to believe, but there's going to be people who are rebelling against Christ. And yet, when they don't bring their offering, they don't bring their tribute, they receive no rain, which is a bad thing. No rain, no crops, no food. So they have to come, they have to show. And yet the enemy's still going to convince them that, you know what, we can take them. We can conquer them. First of all, they seem to have forgotten. I agree, it's 1,000 years prior, but they seem to have forgotten when Jesus showed up that he won like that. But you can imagine the lie. If enough of us get together, we can take them down by sheer numbers. I think they're going to try the Russian methodology of war. Just throw enough people and we'll eventually break it. And so they gather. Now, what's interesting here is John's language of the description of it. So he goes out and to deceive the nations, which are in the four corners of the earth. Now, that's obviously just an expression. Don't go out and say, oh, look, it's a flat earth, the earth's a square. Now, he's using the 4 points of the compass. So he's just saying from the ends of the earth, everybody's going to gather. And then he says this, Gog and Magog. Now, that's a fascinating thing. And even the language that's used here, Gog and Magog, they're going to come, numbers of the sea, the sand shore, they're going to come against the camp, and we'll talk about this in a second. And then fire coming down. All of this imagery is a direct reflection of Ezekiel 38 and 39. It's playing out again, except on a grander scale. And in this idea here is that if you read Ezekiel 38 and 39, Gog is, it refers to a host that's really going to come against God's people in Ezekiel 38. And ultimately, God is going to deliver Israel from this great army. Now, John is taking that same thing and he's expanding who Gog and Magog is. It's not just this one enemy that's going to come against Israel, but rather he's expanded it to all of those who have rebelled against God. All the enemies of God are going to come against the people of God. In other words, this is the real final battle, is what's going to take place. And to understand this, there's no reason to doubt that this is a real people army, given how it's described. Now, I answered this question a couple of weeks ago, but I want to answer it again. Where does this people come from? Where does this numerous, so grand of a people come from during this time frame? Because one of the frameworks says, well, entering into the millennial is nothing but believers. And I don't think the scriptures teach that. And as I shared, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, I quoted from God Answers, which is a good resource, by the way. For you got questions, if you answer a scriptural question, you end up with God Answers. It's actually a pretty good spot. They usually back up all they say with scripture. Except they threw in that line, and everybody and only believers will enter, and they didn't have a scripture reference for it. They just continued on, which caused me to pause. But then as I was studying the scriptures, when I hit Zechariah 14, it clearly gives a description that, and those who did not join in the battle, but were of them. In other words, unbelievers enter the millennial as well. And even if they didn't, so we're going to say, even if that those will argue who are above the age of innocence, whatever that is, they would still have children. You'd have a bunch of children born during that time. And some of them are under the age of 7. If we hold that children are innocent, then they're also going to enter into it. So you're going to have people who are born to 7 years old enter into that time frame who they themselves may not be followers of Christ. So either way, you're still going to have this group who will rebel against Christ. So it does answer who's going to populate this and actually cause this. And when you look, it's like, well, will it really hit that amount? Well, yeah, it could, easily. It's very fascinating. One of the statistical probabilities, here's one of the fascinating things about it, is if you look up how long it would take 8 people to repopulate to the current date we have of 8 billion, allowing also that the population growth only grow at 0.08%. That is actually very minuscule, just so you know. And our population growths are actually much greater than that. But even only allowing that low amount, do you know it lines up perfectly to the biblical timeline of approximately the flood to now? And that we're at 8 billion. That's with 0.08% population growth. Or might be 0.8%. But even still, that is incredibly small. Now, hit a time in history where things have been kind of reset. Sin's still there, but the curse isn't as much of an effect. So the population growth can grow much greater. And you're not going to have the increased child mortality rate. We still have, in essence, medical procedures and knowledge. And we've got the King of Kings, the great physician, overseeing things. The population growth can be huge. But it shows that in the hearts of man, even that population will rebel against him, and they will come. And then it says, and they went and rounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. That's kind of a fascinating thing. Now, there's debate whether that's literal or figurative. And what I mean by that, not that they surround it, but surrounding the camp. They're like, is that literally saying a city and then there's going to be camps and everything around it? Or is it saying, oh, it's just the symbolic language of saying they're completely surrounding all of the people of God? Well, if you think about it, at that time, I can think of a couple of things of why this would be literal. If we're talking at this point of the literal Jerusalem, not the New Jerusalem, the literal Jerusalem, only so many people can fit in that city. And so believers, you can imagine, where are they going to want to be? As close to Jesus as possible. So if they can't live in the city, where will they stay? Just outside the city. Now, even then, let's go something else. We don't know how long is it going to take for the enemy to gather. If the enemy's starting to rise up and rebel against Christ, and Christ is allowing it to gather them for one last thing, what do you think the believers are going to do? They're going to retreat to Christ. And so they would build a camp around Christ. And so this makes perfect sense for it to be a literal event. If a huge enemy horde is coming, they all withdraw back to the Messiah. And so they gather. And they come for battle. Now, here's where it gets interesting. It says, now fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. Now, why I say this is interesting, because when you look at the other end time scenarios, and I'm talking about what would be classified as Christian end time scenarios. And I don't mean in this case Catholicism, Protestantism. No. I'm talking about the Jewish one and the Qumran one. The Qumran community. If you're not familiar with Qumran, they're the ones who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, kind of thing. That's that community. They have something in common that the scriptures are different. In both of their end time final victory, because they understood there to be this final victory that God would have, they actually attribute it to the saints. The saints have the victory. In other words, the army comes, and I want you to think of like how Israel was, and all of a sudden, the people of God are fighting back, and God grants the saints this big victory. And we see that play through the scriptures. Think about at the time of the judges, a great example, Gideon. Gideon, an army of 300 defeats an army of over 100,000. And people are like, wow, look at that, Gideon won the victory. And so when we look at it from the people at Qumran and the Jewish eschatology, the victory belongs to the saints. But here, what does the scripture say? The victory belongs to God. It's God who grants victory. It's not this. This is more the picture of Elisha sitting up on the hill, and the armies come with a set of soldiers. So you come down there, we're taking to the king. Whew, there's fire. And Elisha, he's just sitting there going, next. Until eventually the third guy comes, and he's like, please have mercy. Can you please come? So I know there's soldiers. Please don't kill my men again. Don't have the men die again. It's God who grants the victory. And that's the way it was supposed to be. And so in both cases, even in the first case, when Jesus came the first time here, and I'm talking in Revelation, he comes on the white horse. He's got the armies of heaven with him, but it's the sword from his mouth that wins the victory. And this time the enemies have gathered. It's God who brings down fire and consumes the enemy. And that's something that we should never, ever forget. That ultimately, it is God's victory. And that'll ultimately stop us from becoming arrogant. This is why, although we like to talk about Ephesians 2 verse 8, we are saved by grace through faith. And we're like, and that brings us such assurance. And there is that aspect to it. I'm saved by grace. Therefore, it's not of me. I don't have to worry. I don't have to try to do anything. I don't have to stress about it. It's sold completely by God, and I'm secure in that grace. But it also does something else. The other side of that is, there was nothing I could do. I am completely reliant on Him. I don't get to go, hey, look at me, I'm saved. Hey, look at me, how great I am. No, it goes, it's all because of Him. It's His grace. It's His victory, not mine. And the same is when I always find sports fascinating. Something that years ago here where the Toronto Raptors won the NBA championship. And all of a sudden, the logo and the slogan that went around the country was, "We the North." Did anybody here pick up a basketball? Anybody here put the time in? Anybody here do the trick? No. Who actually won? They did. They put the work in. They put the training in. They won. We celebrated, but they won. And so I don't see anybody going around who's like, hey, do you realize I won the NBA championship? And just so you know, I'm also at least a two-time World Series winner. I've won quite a few Stanley Cups, too. I haven't won a thing. And even when it comes to the final victory, when it comes to salvation, I didn't win a thing. The fact that I get the benefits of it is all because of Christ, because of his victory. And when we look at this final battle, the enemy's gathered his forces. The saints are just sitting there going, I didn't do a thing. We get to share in the victory, but it's ultimately his. This is a side note here. This is why it so bugs me when I hear a teaching about David and Goliath, where it's all about, here's how you can slay your Goliaths, here how can you have your victories. If you want to put us into that story of David and Goliath, we're cowering in the tents, going, who's going to defeat this giant? And it's the Messiah who shows up and destroys the giant, and then we can celebrate. And then our response should be very similar. He's the king. Yeah. And that's what we see here. And may we never forget that. The great enemy, the devil, it's not us who defeated him. We didn't bind him the first time. So one of those things, that's why it gets fascinating. It's like people are praying, Satan, we bind you. Yeah, we don't bind him at all. The binding is done by Christ. And the only reason Satan gets out is not because he's got powerful enough to get out. It's because, okay, let him out. He's let out. It's like, let him roll it away, unlock the door, let him out. And he's only let out to his defeat again by the hand of Christ, not ours. And then what's his point? Where does he end up? And says, the devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are. I found it fascinating that phrase, that title, the lake of fire, that only appears in Revelation. You know that? It doesn't appear anywhere else. It only appears in these chapters. And I was like, that's kind of fascinating. But does that mean it's just something for this that John's just kind of made up? The answer is no. I said that phrase, lake of fire, only appears there. The idea of fire and judgment, that was always there. In fact, I want to show you a couple here. I'm going to go to the good old friend, Book of Daniel. And this is where it is, because we're going to see this in a second, because this plays out. And one of the things, again, that I started with the Book of Daniel, if you remember back with Daniel, I said for a couple of reasons. One was to build up our apocalyptic muscles. In other words, not to be afraid of the imagery, to understand it. And the other one is because a lot of Daniel's prophecy had already come to pass, which means we can study it and go, oh, this is what this means. That's what this beast means. This is what a beast means. And so when we study Revelation, like when it says beast, we're like, okay, we can kind of grasp it. The second is because there's such a strong correlation between what Daniel has written in his day in the 500s BC to what John saw and foretells. And so I'm just going to look here. Daniel chapter 7, 9 and 10. He says this, I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery steam issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The courts and seats and the books were opened. And I watched then, because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain, and its body destroyed, and given to the burning flame. See, judgment? It's all there, the judgment. And then as you go through the Old Testament, and there's a reason I wanted to read that, because we're going to come back to that in a second. You've got all through it, Isaiah 66, verse 24, you're probably more familiar with this one from the New Testament. It talks about the undying worm and the unquenchable fire. Malachi 4:1, the day is coming, and it'll burn like an oven. Jesus talking, Matthew 25, eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 8 and 9, it talks about the flaming fire, eternal destruction. This idea of the flaming judgment is not something new. Did Jesus often use imagery that was around him? Absolutely he did. In fact, the book of John is filled with it. Every time that you hear Jesus say something like, I am the blank, almost every time it had something to do with what was around them. For like, I am the living water, that was during the feast, and at that time of the feast, they would actually go out, draw water, and bring it in, and quote scripture saying, this is the living water, and Jesus is like, no, 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 I'm the living water. When we get, I am the vine, you are the branches, if you actually look at the text, you can kind of figure out that they left the upper room, and they were traveling to the Mount of Olives, and while they're traveling, the most likely they passed by the temple, and there's an archway there that had the vine above it, and it says like Israel is the vine, and it'd be Jesus going, no, 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 I'm the true vine. I'm the one you have to abide in. And so when Jesus, and this is where people try to say, well, hell's not real, it's just imagery, it would be nothing for Jesus to look and use Gehenna, the valley of the garbage dump, to say that's kind of the picture. Because the flame doesn't go out there as they continue to burn. But he says that's just something so you can understand it and get a kind of a glimpse of it. But fire is always connected to judgment. That's why I use the Old Testament there. Because Daniel's saying the beast, what's going to happen? He's cut up, he's defeated, and is given to the flame. And when you look at what happened to the description of the beast in Revelation, what is he? Well, he's taken and he's thrown into the lake of fire. The other thing about this is many, when they look at the lake of fire, they say, well, it's annihilation. They get thrown in there and then they cease no more. Well, you've got a problem here because what does it say? They'll be tormented day and night forever and ever. In fact, when Jesus talks about the judgment in Matthew, he says the righteous will raise to everlasting life and the others to everlasting destruction. And one thing people are like, well, it's like, well, it can't be, it's not everlasting. And then you look at it, and there is some play in the English. It says to everlasting life, the other one says eternal. But in the actual language, it's the exact same word. I'm not just talking about the same root word, it's the same word. So if you try to say that one's temporary and the other one's eternal, you're inconsistent. Because it's in the same section. You can't even say it's separate. It's one right after the other. Not only that, earlier when we talked about the angels, I get it here. The proclamation of the three angels, Revelation 14. Starting at verse 9, then a third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and his image and receives his mark on his forehead or on his hand, he himself shall also drink the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out at full strength into the cup of his indignation. He shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. And they have no rest day or night. It's the same language. And I know people, they bucket that and they're like, I don't really like that idea. How could God allow them to be tormented forever? Because the offense of sin is against an eternal God. It's not a temporal offense. It is an utmost highest crime. We downplay it, but it's eternal. This is where, if you were part of the systematic theology class when we covered salvation, we looked at why Jesus had to come, why he had to be fully God, fully man, because only the eternal God could pay for an eternal sin, but at the same time, it was man's sin, so he had to become a man as well. And he's fully God and fully man, because he's the only one who could pay the eternal consequence on man's behalf. And that just shows how merciful and loving God is. And so he's thrown in there. So the judgment is not this one-time thing. It's not, oh, there you go, yeah, you ceased. It says, no, they shall have no rest. Like it or not, ceasing to exist is a rest, as much as it can be. And so this time, it's time where Satan is finally defeated. Humanity has no more excuse. And now what happens? The judgment. The final judgment. And this is why I read also Daniel 7. Let's go on. Revelation chapter 20, verse 11. It says, Then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, whose face the earth and the heaven fled away. And there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God. And books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works, by the things which were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. All right. Again, the reason I wanted to read Daniel 7 is because one of the questions we ask is, who's doing this judgment here? It's one of those fascinating things, like who's really doing the final judgment? Because as you study even Jesus' explanation, it's like the Father has the final judgment, and he commits all judgment to the Son, and then the Son commits all judgment to the Father. So it's kind of like, okay, what's going on here? And then you get a spot here. It says, Then a great white throne, and him who sat on it, whose face the earth and heaven fled away. If this was another way of saying Jesus, then why didn't he just say that? And what I mean by that is, Christ is already here. He's already reigning. He's reigning from Jerusalem. He's executed his judgment, and now there's the final judgment. And then when we combine this, though, with Daniel chapter 7, notice it says, And I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. And his garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. And it talks about his throne. And then what does it say at the end of that section, the end of verse 10? And the court was seated, and the books were opened. You compare that to here, what does it say? He was seated on his throne, his face, heaven and earth went away. The dead, the small, great were standing before God, and the books were opened. This is the one who's executing the final judgment. And just so you know, how is his judgment actually executed here? I'm jumping ahead for a second. Notice it's actually based on the Lamb's book of life. So he's making the judgment, but who's making the final say? The Lamb. It's based on who's in his book. So this is why it doesn't contradict. They're both making the judgment. But it just turns out, who's sitting on this throne? Well, the Father is. So to this point, they hadn't seen the face of the Father. They saw the Son, who was fully God and fully man. Now the Father steps in and executes the judgment, the final judgment. And with this, what do we see? It says, and I love this verse, and the earth and the heavens fled away. Just how magnificent he is. And again, I want to note here, this isn't the first time we've seen the Father on the throne, and I use that term very loosely, seeing the Father on the throne, because it never describes him. It's just, there he is. And there was one seated on the throne. Daniel, what does it say? Just, he's the Ancient of Days. Even earlier on, it's one seated on the throne, and fire and lightning and rumbling comes out. It never describes him, because it can't. This is one words never, yeah, it's beyond words. So it's just like, there he is. And any way that I tried to describe it would be inadequate. And when I think about this, and I'll end with this, is because as I was studying this passage, this is where one of the old songs kind of came to my mind. Turn your eyes upon Jesus, and the things of earth will go strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. And I think the Father comes in, and it's like, I don't think you're talking about heaven and earth really going to disappear at this point. I think it's just in the light of his actual majesty, everything else disappears. I think that's the only way John could describe it. That he comes and just like heaven and earth, it just seems that as he came, it just receded. It's kind of like if you carry a lantern into a dark room, and as it moves, the shadows seem to just run away as the light moves. And the glory and the majesty of God coming down. And at this point, God has come to execute his judgment against humanity. And he's not going to depart again, because as we get to it, the new heaven and the new earth are created, and the first thing it says is, and the dwelling of God is now with men. And he's so brilliant that there is no light or dark. We don't need the sun or the moon anymore. His glory and his radiance is there. And so now humanity, all of the rest of it, is going to be standing before the judgment seat, and they're going to be judged. And next week when we gather, we're going to talk about this judgment. We'll talk about these books and what is coming down, and seeing how even in the end, the declaration will be made that true and just are your judgments, O God, and all of his judgments are holy.